Okay, excellent. So our second speaker this evening is Roberta Colbertaldo. Roberta is a research fellow at Goethe Universität in Frankfurt in Italian and French literature. She is currently part of a DFG-funded project, which translates as Fat Worlds, Utopian and Anti-Dystopian Anti-Utopian Discourses about Food and Bodies in the Pre-Modern Age. And Roberta tells me there's a special issue of Food and History that is kind of coming out, or you're working on at the moment, I think. Could be out in the future on a workshop related to the project, so look out for that. She's also, correct me if I'm wrong, writing a book on the representations of Carnival and Lent, and the abundance and fasting and their semiotic, symbolic, and cultural implications. And Roberta's paper this evening is entitled Practical and Poetical Food Lists in the Battles Between Carnival and Lent. So take it away, Roberta.
Thank you, Charlie, for the presentation and for giving me the opportunity to participate to this seminar. I'm very glad to be here. I will share my screen. I am, yes, as you said, I am a literary scholar and I'm working on a monograph on textual and visual representations of Carnival and Lent. Working on Carnival and Lent representations, food symbols are one of the main aspects I need to investigate. So I'm happy to hear any feedback from your perspective as food historians. Today I would like to present some literary texts on the motif of the battle between Carnival and Lent, which were broadly published between the 13th and the 18th century. I believe that their common feature through the centuries are food lists, so they are used differently and with different functions. From a literary and semiotic point of view, Umberto Eco, Robert Belknap, and Eva von Konzen have explored the structure, meanings, and functions of lists. Robert Belknap formulates a useful definition. I quote, "At its most simple, a list is a framework that holds separate and disparate items together. It is plastic, flexible structure in which an array of constituent units coheres with specific relations generated by specific forces of attraction. Generally, such structures may be built to appear random, or they may be organized by some overt principle." He thus defines two very general formal categories of literary lists: built to appear random or organized by some overt principle. Eva von Konzen adds a differentiation between prototypical lists without any syntactic structure. I quote, "The items of the list form part of a sentence and are linked by connectives." And a more open list structure, syntactically embedded, that means with a more complex grammatical structure. Umberto Eco has published an anthology of texts with critical essays on the evolution of lists in word literature and figurative arts, which he developed as part of an exhibition at the Louvre. He becomes sometimes also quite technical, showing the strict relation between semiotics and rhetoric. In a chapter on the rhetoric of the list, after describing the different types of lists used throughout the centuries as enumeratio, oratorical amplification, or congeries, as well as anaphora, asyndeton, or polysyndeton, he states something that is closely related to our topic, since food lists often seem to refer to abundance and literally to voraciousness. I quote, "In traditional rhetoric, there is no intrinsic definition of what strikes us as the dizzying voraciousness of the list, especially of fairly long list of different things, albeit rendered homogeneous by a single universe of discourse, such as drink or money." So there are some definitions of concept to describe this phenomenon, but I would say that literary food lists still elude a precise theoretical framework. The battle between Carnival and Lent is a motif we can find in texts belonging to different genres, from popular theater to epic poems. As I said, it spread over a long period of time from the 13th to the 18th century, and is most common in France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, although examples have also been listed in England, Sweden, and Eastern Europe. I am actually focusing on France and Italy. The protagonists of these narratives are personifications of two times of the year that by definition in the Christian tradition imply different diets. Roughly, on one hand, fish and vegetables, on the other hand, meat and pastries. These texts present a basic plot whose outcome cannot vary because it is tied to annual rituals. Carnival comes every year, but lasts no more than a couple of days, weeks at most, and is followed by 40 days of Lent. Yet variation in the unfolding and those in the descriptions of the two protagonists interact in defining their values. Whether Carnival is appreciated or neglected and criticized reveals the authors and perhaps the audience's approach to it. Conspicuous and prominent lists are largely used to describe and characterize the two contenders and their armies. The descriptions of the armies are part of the allegory of the battle and are strictly connected with their narratives. Eva von Konzen has posited the problem of description as opposed to narration in the frame of the conceptualization of list, as she noted that narration and description interact in the list, which should not be considered a mere interruption in the plot. The most famous list based on this battle is in chapters 59 and 60 of Rabelais' Carnival, respectively listing in length the dishes offered to Gastier during Carnival days and then during Lenten days. Its publication date, 1552, almost corresponds to that of Bruegel's equally famous painting of the battle motif, about 1559. In Rabelais, the lists are extensive and overwhelming. Umberto Eco identifies in them, I quote, the beginning of a poetics of the list for the list, written for love of the list by excess. Timothy Tomasic has gone into this in depth in his study of these chapters and has shown that this excess is not a figment of Rabelais' imagination, but a composition of precise sources, and that the lists resemble the Renaissance cookbooks, which are, however, to be understood as a buffet from which certain dishes can be chosen, and thus do not correspond to a satire of excess. But I want to focus on the earlier models of Bruegel and Rabelais and reflect on the literary strategies put in place for these representations of the battles in which food lists already played a key role. I present a selection from the second half of the 13th century to the beginning of the 16th century. Two French texts, La bataille du charisme et des charnages, et Eustache de Champ Ballade 350, and one Italian, Il contrasto di Carnevale e di Quaresima. La bataille de charisme et des charnages is an anonymous poem of 574 lines, published by Grégoire Lozinski in 1933. It represents the allegorical battle between Carnival and Lent, and their armies are made of foods typically eaten in the respective times. Lenten army is firstly described as being populated by fish. I show the French text and I propose a translation. He was accompanied by a large parade of fresh fish with white garlic, fresh salmon, and good flounder. Garlic is here only the dressing sauce, but above all, Lent is presented as something loved by a part of the society. The people of Beauvais, Ile-de-France, and those around Orléans much prefer fish to venison or good beef with garlic. Both the description of the armies and the actual combat in the second part of the poem consist of lists of foodstuffs, but they are always personified. They actively participate to the combat. Two central examples are on the next slide. The small fish from the first front, the small fish form the first front. The stewed eels follow in order of battle. Then come French herring with white garlic, and mallet, haddock, whiting, and goldfish, and many other fish come to the fore. And then oil fights with lard, almond sauce with ledoux, honey oils itself on oatmeal cream, so much so that the edges overflow. Even ready meals are mentioned in the bataille as characters participating in the battle, or as garment of the two barons, Carnival and Lent. The allegory of the conflict between Carnival and Lent, unlike in later centuries, is fully and consistently realized in all its details. The second example is authored by Eustache de Champs, who lived between 1340 and 44, and was a poet at the king's court. His environment, therefore, corresponded in every respect to the context in which Carnival was possibly celebrated and sung, but at the same time despised by the church. He thus certainly addressed an aristocratic audience. His extensive poetic oeuvre consists of about 1,500 texts, over 1,000 of which are ballads. They are characterized for their satirical themes, critical against the church and society. In the Champs ballade contre le carême, against Lent, we find a clear reference to the battle. The 5 stanzas that make up the text contain direct speech of Mardi Gras, who warns Carnival, called again Charnage, of the attack of Lent. The first stanza lists the typical foods of Carnival, and the second stanza those of Lent. Bœuf, conine, and chapon, that means beef, rabbits, and capons, are amongst the most frequently mentioned foods in the Champs corpus, in which 190 poems out of 1,500 contain food elements. Susanna Bliggenstoffer has catalogued the food mentions and observed that in most cases, food is used by the Champs to underline the satirical purpose of his poetry. On the contrary, Chevrelot and Malard, goats and ducks, appear solely in this poem. While the foods of Carnival are those that are forbidden during Lent, those of Lent are described as not very appetizing. The two stanzas are made of similar elementary elements, and nonetheless they have substantial difference, because in the first one we are dealing with animals that are typically eaten during Carnival time and which are here participate in the imaginary combat, while in the second we are dealing with food served to the poor during Lent, garlic and onions, hemp oil, stinky herring, rotten sea fish. Differently, there is no moralistic connotation in the last text I am presenting. Contrasto di Carnevale de Quaresima is a poem written in Italian and probably inspired by the French models. Form and style are those of epic poetry, and the metre is the octave. The text survived in many copies. Gabriele Bucchi, who is working on its critical edition, has found 16, dating from the end of the 15th to the beginning of the 17th century. I quote from one conserved at British Library and dated by the librarians 1520. Also here, there are two powers in the world that clash. One dedicated to temporal power and one to spiritual power. It begins by, I'm sorry. It begins by talking about the tables and the banquets of Carnival, as in stanza 4. To announce the arrival of Lent, un capodaglio forte e arrabbiato, the garlic, is sent as ambassador. When fatty foods and Lenten foods are called to the battle, vegetables and fish also become animated to actively participate. Or tu vedevi le bietole corrire e le radici uscire da sottoterra e gli spinaci e i cavoli sfuggire perché avevano paura della guerra, o quante rape vedevi venire per andare a scorrere la loro terra. Cipolle, agli, pestinache e porri corrono in sulle mura e in sulle torri. The list corresponds to those lists identified by Consen as open, in that they do not respond to the rules of the asyndeton or polysyndeton, but on the contrary are inserted into the narrative. This is only one stanza, but it continues like this for several stanzas. On one hand, the enumeratio serves the narration, but on the other hand, I believe that the narrative itself is constructive to expose the variety of foods allowed in this period. At the gathering of the animals, however, a distinction is made between the animals of the forest, the lion, the dormouse, the turtle, and those who are prepared by Carnival to be eaten, roasted, fried, or boiled. Arrostire, fritte e lessare. A similar anaphora, as in stanza 40 of the first canto, which describes the army of the Carnival gathering, is used in the second canto, stanza 62, to describe, after the defeat of Lent, its army fleeing. Through the duplicity of these lists as possible elements and as allegorical participants in the battle, the reader or listener is constantly led to shift between practical and poetical meaning. To conclude, from a literary perspective, I find very interesting the oscillation between the actual foods consumed during the two periods of Carnival and Lent and their adaptability to the battle narrative. In particular, the dynamism of the Carnival army is due to the participation of animals, while the French bataille is a true allegory down to the last detail. The Chambellad ballad announces a critique of Lent based on the advantages of certain social classes for the availability of particular Lenten foods. Lenten food for the common people is, on the contrary, rotten. The Italian contrasto, on its part, uses the list as a typical form of epic poetry, as has been described by Eva von Konzen. In the mentioned article published in 2016, she focuses on epic lists and identifies the catalogue of ships in the second book of Homer's Iliad as a model for all epic catalogues as taken up in Latin literature by Virgil, Lucano, Ovid, and Statius. In the contrasto, this form is widely used with two different functions. Many foods and dishes become combatants or are used as the clothes for the two lords, but at the same time, others are mentioned only as food and are even prepared on the fictional scene. Thank you.